The night was a sodden canvas of rain and shadow as I stood under the cracked awning of a nameless pawnshop, clutching the box of artifacts to my chest. My breath curled in the frigid air, mixing with the scent of wet asphalt and decay. The transaction had been quick and silent, a weathered man in a dark trench coat handing me the collection without so much as a receipt. It had all the hallmarks of illegitimacy, but I needed the money. Business had been slow, and rent would not wait. The box was heavier than it looked, its contents shifting with a faint metallic clink as I carried it to my cramped studio apartment. Once inside, I placed it on my cluttered desk and flipped the latch. The lid creaked open, revealing an assortment of trinkets. An ornate hand mirror tarnished with age, a porcelain doll with one milky eye, a rusted locket, and several other items that seemed to hum with a faint energy I couldn't quite explain. Something about the artifacts unnerved me. Their surfaces were marred with signs of wear, scratches that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. My fingers hovered over the mirror, its dark glass reflecting my hesitant expression. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement behind me, a fleeting shadow darting out of sight. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was still. "It's just my imagination," I muttered, shutting the box with a snap. Yet, as the night wore on, an unease settled over me like a damp shroud. The rain outside persisted, its rhythm broken by occasional bursts of static-like whispers. I ignored them, telling myself they were just echoes of my overworked mind. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, weaving through the room like invisible threads. Unable to sleep, I returned to the box. This time I felt compelled to examine the objects more closely. Each one seemed to exude a quiet sorrow, an almost palpable sense of longing. The porcelain doll's cracked smile twisted unnaturally in the dim light, and the locket refused to open, no matter how much I fiddled with its clasp. When I touched the hand mirror again, the whispers coalesced into a single, unmistakable word. "Help." I recoiled, nearly dropping the mirror. My hands trembled as I placed it back in the box. The air around me grew heavier, pressing against my chest with an invisible weight. I closed the box tightly, but the whispers didn't stop. They lingered, faint and accusing, long into the night. The following morning, the rain had turned into a persistent drizzle, painting the world in muted shades of gray. I hadn't slept. The whispers had faded as dawn approached, leaving me hollow-eyed and jittery. Despite my unease, I convinced myself the events of the previous night had been a product of exhaustion and a guilty conscience. But the objects refused to let me forget them. As I prepared to catalog the artifacts, a faint vibration ran through the desk. I froze, my pen hovering above the notebook. It was coming from the box. Slowly, cautiously, I opened the lid. The mirror had shifted, its surface shimmering faintly despite the overcast light filtering through my window. My reflection stared back at me, but something was off. The background was wrong, distorted, almost unrecognizable. The cluttered room behind me seemed stretched, the walls bending unnaturally toward a vanishing point. Then there was movement. Not in the mirror, but in the room itself. A subtle, flickering shadow darted from corner to corner, its form too amorphous to identify. My breath hitched as a soft, melodic hum filled the air. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily louder, carrying with it a sense of sorrow that sent shivers down my spine. "Who's there?" I whispered, though the words felt feeble in the oppressive silence. The hum abruptly stopped, replaced by a voice, gentle, pleading, and achingly human. "Find them." The voice emanated from the locket, which now lay open in the box. Inside, a tiny photograph was pressed against the velvet lining, a faded image of a young woman, her expression solemn and weary. Beneath the photo, etched into the metal, were the words, "Forever bound, never free." I slammed the box shut, my pulse thundering in my ears. This wasn't normal. This wasn't possible. And yet, the objects seemed alive, desperate to tell their story. I needed answers, but the thought of digging deeper filled me with a bone-deep dread. I spent the day scouring the internet, poring over local records, and even calling a few contacts in the antiques trade. Nothing concrete came up, but I began to notice a pattern. Reports of stolen artifacts like these always carried rumors of strange occurrences, flickering lights, cold spots, disembodied voices. One article mentioned a series of disappearances tied to a small village that had been abandoned decades ago, its inhabitants rumored to have dabbled in occult practices. The name of the village echoed in my mind as I stared at the box of artifacts, the words etched on the locket ringing like a warning bell. Forever bound, never free. The whispers returned that night, louder than before. This time they carried a sense of urgency, their fragmented phrases stitching together a chilling truth. The artifacts weren't just cursed. They were pieces of something much larger, fragments of lives stolen and trapped by forces I was only beginning to comprehend. The whispers became a part of my world, trailing me like an unshakable shadow. Each artifact in the box seemed to possess its own voice, fragments of personalities bleeding into my thoughts. The mirror in particular had grown more active. Its surface shimmered whenever I passed, and sometimes I caught glimpses of things that weren't there. Streaks of movement, the faint outline of faces watching me from a place I couldn't reach. Desperation drove me to delve deeper into the history of the village tied to the artifacts. The name, Havenmore, surfaced again and again in old newspapers and scattered archives. It had been a thriving community a century ago, known for its intricate crafts and peculiar festivals. But then, whispers of dark practices began to spread. Rituals performed in secret. Objects imbued with strange powers. And then, one winter night, the entire village had vanished. No bodies were ever found, no explanations given. Just the remnants of lives abruptly severed, the buildings left to decay under a shroud of mystery. As I read more, the artifacts on my desk began to stir, their presence growing heavier, more insistent. The doll's one good eye glinted with a strange light, and the locket occasionally snapped open, its clasp clicking with a sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a connection to Havenmore. The artifacts felt alive, eager to guide me to something they wanted me to see. Against my better judgment, I allowed myself to listen. Each night I placed the mirror on the desk and waited. The whispers would come, disjointed and faint at first, but gradually forming coherent phrases. They spoke of the binding, a ritual the cult had used to preserve their souls in objects, ensuring a twisted form of immortality. The process was incomplete, they said, flawed. The trapped spirits could communicate, but not escape, their existence a half-life tied to the physical world. Then came the warnings. They will gather again. They will finish what they started. I pressed them for details, but the voices faltered, their anguish bleeding into the room. Each attempt left me with a growing sense of dread. If the whispers were to be believed, the cult hadn't disappeared. They were waiting, preparing for a reunion. And the artifacts in my possession were the key to their return. That night, the locket clattered open, the tiny photograph glowing faintly. The words beneath it seemed to shift, twisting into something new. Seek the bell tower. Midnight. The bell tower was a relic of Havenmore's forgotten past, its silhouette looming against the moonless sky like a skeletal finger pointing toward the heavens. I arrived just before midnight, the artifacts packed in a satchel slung over my shoulder. The air was heavy, thick with the promise of something unnatural. The village ruins were eerily quiet, the decayed buildings casting jagged shadows that seemed to stretch and breathe. As I approached the tower, a faint vibration coursed through the ground beneath my feet. The whispers grew louder, blending into a single, mournful chant. Find them. Free us. The plea carried an edge of desperation, and I couldn't ignore the sense that time was running out. The bell tower door groaned open, revealing a spiraling staircase that climbed into darkness. The air inside was colder, each step an effort as the weight of unseen eyes pressed against me. At the top, the room opened into a circular space, dominated by an enormous bell. Its surface was etched with the same symbols I'd seen on the locket and mirror, intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The whispers ceased the moment I stepped inside. Silence enveloped me, oppressive and complete, broken only by the faint creak of the ancient wood beneath my boots. I set the satchel down, pulling out the artifacts. They pulsed faintly, their energies sinking in a way that made the air hum. Then I felt it. A presence. It wasn't visible at first, but I could sense it coalescing in the corners of the room. A dark fog seeped from the cracks in the walls, swirling and twisting as it took form. The shadows merged into figures, vague spectral shapes that radiated malice. Their eyes glowed faintly, twin embers in the gloom. The bell began to sway, its clapper moving without a touch. Each swing sent vibrations through the room, low and resonant, the sound almost hypnotic. The figures moved closer, their forms solidifying into something humanoid but wrong. Their limbs were elongated, their faces hollow and twisted. "You brought them," a voice rasped, low and layered, emerging from the shadows. It wasn't a question but a statement, a recognition of the artifacts that now glowed faintly on the floor. The spectral figures circled them like predators around prey. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. The lead figure tilted its head, the motion unnervingly smooth. "Completion," it whispered. "We have waited, bound, silent. Now, the ritual resumes." A chill crept over me as the truth sank in. The cult hadn't been vanquished. They had been imprisoned within the artifacts, waiting for someone to bring them together. And I had done exactly that. The bell's toll reverberated again, shaking the tower. The artifacts pulsed in unison, their light growing brighter, almost blinding. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, not from the figures, but from the objects themselves. "Stop them." Before I could react, the bell's toll reached a crescendo. The spectral figures froze, their forms flickering like dying flames. And then, the light from the artifacts exploded outward, bathing the room in a blinding brilliance. When the light faded, the figures were gone, and the artifacts lay silent once more. But the bell continued to swing, its sound now carrying a final, chilling message. This is not the end. The bell tower was silent now, save for the faint echo of the last toll reverberating in the cold air. My breaths came in shallow gasps, the weight of what had just transpired pressing down on me. The artifacts lay scattered at my feet, their once vibrant glow extinguished, their surfaces dull and lifeless. But the room wasn't empty. The air still pulsed faintly with a presence, unseen but undeniably there, a reminder that the ritual had been interrupted, not destroyed. I reached for the mirror first, its glass surprisingly warm against my trembling fingers. My reflection stared back at me, distorted and warped. Behind me, the shadows of the bell tower twisted unnaturally, coiling into shapes that defied reason. Faces emerged in the dark, hollow-eyed specters that watched with an eerie stillness. Their presence felt accusatory, as if blaming me for disturbing their fragile prison. "You cannot silence what has been set free." The words were not spoken aloud, but pressed into my thoughts, heavy and unrelenting. I stumbled back, clutching the mirror as the temperature around me plummeted. Frost crept along the edges of the bell, its runes glowing faintly as if they were trying to awaken once more. The bell's motion had ceased, yet its clapper hung mid-swing, as though time itself had faltered. I turned to the other artifacts, now pulsing faintly in unison. They hummed with a desperate energy, their fragmented whispers forming a plea. "Return us, bind us, before it rises." "Bind you? How?" My voice cracked under the weight of the question. The locket snapped open, the photograph inside glowing faintly. The woman's face was clearer now, her sorrow etched deeply into her expression. Below her, new words appeared, written as though scratched into the metal by invisible hands. "Seal the bell. Break the chain." The bell's runes flared, casting the room in a cold silver light. The shadows thickened, converging toward the bell as a low rhythmic hum filled the space. The figures began to emerge again, not fully formed, but enough to send a chill racing down my spine. They moved with unnatural grace, their shapes flickering like smoke caught in a shifting wind. Each step they took reverberated through the floorboards, a reminder of the delicate barrier that still held them. I gathered the artifacts, their weight heavier than before. The mirror's surface shimmered with faint, fleeting images. A woman weeping, a man clutching the locket, a child's hand reaching for the porcelain doll. Each scene flickered out of existence as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind only a sense of loss so profound it made my chest ache. The shadows pressed closer, their forms blending into the walls and floor. One by one, they reached for the bell, their spectral hands curling around the runes that pulsed beneath their touch. The hum grew louder, shaking the very foundation of the tower. "Seal the bell. Break the chain." I didn't know what I was doing, but instinct drove my movements. I placed the artifacts at the base of the bell, arranging them so their faint pulses aligned. The air seemed to respond, tightening and swirling as if drawn toward the objects. The bell's runes dimmed, flickering like a candle caught in a gust of wind. The spectral figures recoiled, their forms wavering as if struggling to maintain their hold on the room. The whispers from the artifacts rose in intensity, their fractured voices weaving together into a single, resonant command. "Now." I placed my hand on the locket and whispered a plea, though I didn't know who I was speaking to. "Let them rest. End this." The locket snapped shut, and a wave of cold energy surged through the room. The bell quivered, its surface darkening as the runes faded into obscurity. The shadows writhed violently, their forms disintegrating as the light from the artifacts flared brighter than ever. Then, silence. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, leaving me breathless and trembling. The bell tower felt empty, hollow, as though the spirits that had haunted it had finally departed. The artifacts lay dormant, their energy spent. I gathered them into the satchel, careful not to disturb their fragile stillness. As I descended the staircase, the night outside felt lighter, the darkness less suffocating. The ruins of Havenmoor were still and quiet, the spectral presence that had lingered here now gone. But as I stepped into the open air, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. The bell tower loomed behind me, its shadow stretching unnaturally long against the moonlit ground. For a moment I thought I heard it. Faint, distant, and mournful. Dome. The sound sent a shiver through me, a reminder that some things could never be fully silenced. I turned away and walked into the night, the weight of the artifacts heavy on my shoulder and the whispers of the past still echoing faintly in my mind. They were silent now, but I knew, deep down, that silence had a way of speaking louder than words.